A quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today for consideration of H.R. 1140, the Rights of Transportation Security Officers Act, H.R. 1494, the HBCU Homeland Security Partnership Act, H.R. 5273, the Securing America's Ports Act, H.R. 5670, the Transportation Security Transparency Improvement Act, H.R. 5678, the Privacy Officer Enhancement Act, H.R. 5679, the CISA Director Reform Act, H.R. 5680, the Cybersecurity Vulnerability Identification and Notification Act of 2020. The Chair wishes to announce that to the extent practicable, it is my intention to take any recorded votes as they are requested and to not roll votes, and that the Chair may recess the committee at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we will be considering 7 bipartisan measures. While some of the measures take on emerging homeland security challenges, others speak to long-standing ones. The road to H.R. 1140, the Rights for Transportation Security Officers Act, has been a long one. The frontline workforce at TSA has been waiting for nearly 2 decades to get the rights, compensation, and protections that most other federal workers take for granted. H.R. 1140, that would happen. I'm pleased that it is unprecedented bipartisan support. Today, with the consideration of H.R. 5679 and H.R. 5680, the committee will also be advancing measures to ensure that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has the necessary tools to protect industrial control systems and other critical infrastructure from cyber threats and to ensure stability in CISA leadership. In addition to these measures, we'll be considering bills to bolster the scanning of dangerous cargo at land ports, strengthening the DHS Privacy Office, foster partnerships between DHS and historically black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions, and enhance transportation security. I look forward to today's debate and to seeing these bills advance to the floor and then to the Senate. While the committee has had some success working with the Senate, most notably the Nonprofit Security Grants Program Act, which was signed into law in recent days, there are over 30 bills that the House approved that have yet to be acted upon by the Senate. In the coming months, we'll be looking to the Senate to not only advance these measures, but to extend the authorization for DHS's Chemical Security Program, and in the spring, work with us on DHS's authorization legislation. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Rogers, for an opening statement.
I want to thank the chairman and his staff for working with us on this important markup. Many of the bills we will consider today present effective solutions to important homeland security issues. I hope we can incorporate these and other bills into a robust DHS authorization product in the next few months. I wanted to briefly highlight the Republican bills on today's agenda. H.R. 5679, offered by Mr. Katko, will help ensure steady and competent leadership at CISA by setting a statutory 5-year term for its director. I want to thank the subcommittee ranking member for his leadership on this issue. H.R. 5670, offered by Mr. Bishop, will enhance aviation security by improving the level of communication and coordination between TSA and the aviation stakeholders. I want to thank the gentleman for his strong work on this important issue. H.R. 5678, offered by our newest member, Mr. Van Drew, will formally authorize the DHS Office of Privacy and strengthen the department's privacy policies. I commend the gentleman for his efforts on this critical issue. I'm happy to support these Republican bills as well as legislation authored by the chairman to improve coordination between DHS and our nation's HBCUs. The bill from Ms. Torres-Small and Mr. Crenshaw requiring a plan for improving screening at our ports, and legislation from Mr. Langeman and Mr. Katko authorizing critically needed administrative subpoena authority for CISA. I encourage all members to support these bills. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Rogers. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. By agreement, the chair and ranking member of the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object, would the chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster? And I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman and for all committee members for agreeing to use an amendment roster. We have agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. Additionally, it is my understanding that there is bipartisan agreement on some of the bills and amendments thereto. Accordingly, the chair will be asking unanimous consent to consider those bills and amendments thereto en bloc in the interest of time. The members with bills or amendments included in the en bloc will be recognized for a statement at the conclusion of the markup.
I thank the chairman for his explanation, and I announce that I intend to support the en bloc when it's offered, and I withdraw my reservation.
I now call up H.R. 1140. The bill circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1140, the Rights for Transportation Security Officers Act.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Thompson to H.R. 1140.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purposes of amendment. I recognize myself to explain the amendment. Today, we'll be considering H.R. 1140, the Rights for Transportation Security Officers Act of 2020. For well over a decade, Chairwoman Nita Lowry and I have championed this measure to provide basic rights and benefits to the TSA frontline security workforce. This Congress, with the support of the American Federation of Government Employees, we have built unprecedented bipartisan support for the bill. To date, it has 238 bipartisan co-sponsors. It's great timing for Congressman Van Drew to be joining us for this markup on the committee, as he's a co-sponsor of the bill, as are all Democrats. H.R. 1140 has gained broad support because over the years, the need for it has become increasingly clear. Let me provide a brief history here, since only a handful of us were in Congress when TSA was stood up. When Congress established TSA very quickly after September 11th, TSA was given broad authority to develop an entirely new personnel system. At that time, the logic was that TSA needed the authority to create a modern and flexible personnel system to respond to what was a very uncertain threat landscape. Unfortunately, the 21st century personnel system never came to fruition. Instead, TSA's system more closely resembles those of the 19th century, before organized labor secured workforce protections that most American workers take for granted. The TSA administrator has full discretion to set employee pay and benefits and has used his flexibility to mostly benefit senior management, not the frontline workforce. One senior management, for example, was given $90,000 in bonuses in a single year, a practice that would be prohibited under Title V. In contrast, transportation security officers, or TSOs, are among the lowest paid federal employees, and as we saw during the government shutdown, many of them had to work from paycheck to paycheck. TSA does not provide standard pay raises or retention pay. In fact, the majority of officers, including those who've been with the agency for 10 or 15 years, remain at or near the bottom of entry-level TSA pay bands. To make matters worse, a TSO who is subject to a disciplinary action cannot appeal to an independent third party, such as the Merit Systems Protection Board. Instead, TSA's senior management serves as judge, jury, and executioner for disciplinary proceedings. TSOs cannot organize to fight these unfair policies because under TSA's system, they have very limited collective bargaining rights. Since the Obama administration, the frontline workforce has been allowed to unionize, but over the years, the scope of issues that TSA has been willing to negotiate has been repeatedly scaled back. We all know that TSA struggles with unsustainability and low morale as TSA consistently ranks near the bottom of the annual Best Places to Work survey. This year, TSA ranked 415th out of 415th agency subcomponents, dead last on pay satisfaction. Unsurprisingly, this dissatisfaction leads to significant attrition. According to the DHS Inspector General, over a 2-year span in 2016 and 2017, 1 in 3 TSOs quit. That is no way to run a critical security agency. The time has come for us to bring TSA into the 21st century. The Rights to TSOs Act will put TSA under Title V like most other federal agencies. Under Title V, TSOs will receive better pay and regular salary increases. Employees who feel that they have been unfairly disciplined will have the opportunity to have their case considered by an independent party. TSA would still be able to remove officers from screening if their presence jeopardizes government interests. Some of my colleagues would likely point out that transitioning to Title V will be expensive. It is true that a transition will have large upfront costs like the range of $700 million over 5 years based on past Congressional Budget Office's estimate. However, the cost of maintaining the status quo are too high. The DHS IG found in 2017 alone, TSA spent approximately $16 million to hire and train nearly 2,000 people who left within 6 months of being hired. Further, a stable and professional workforce with more overall experience and training will assist TSA in addressing security vulnerabilities and covert testing failures. We owe it to the officers who serve on the front lines of our transportation systems and defend our country against threats to provide them with the appropriate pay and protections. We also owe it to the flying public to continue to develop TSA into the professional, capable national security agency that Congress originally envisioned. I thank my colleagues for their support of this bill. With that, I yield back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Transportation Security Administration's mission is to protect the traveling public by securing America's transportation systems. Since 2001, Congress has recognized that in order for TSA to successfully carry out its critical mission, it had to accommodate the agency's unique operational needs. When we passed the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, we gave TSA one-of-a-kind authorities to respond to evolving threats. We understood that flexibility was key to an effective TSA. That's why I'm very concerned about the impact this bill will have on the security of our aviation system. By moving the screener workforce under Title V, this bill would eliminate many of those critical flexibilities. For example, current law allows for a one-step removal process for employees guilty of significant misconduct, including those facing criminal prosecution. TSA is empowered to immediately remove an employee if he or she intentionally allows guns or explosives through the checkpoint. Under this bill, that employee could remain on the TSA payroll for years. Current law allows the TSA to move screeners between duty stations to alleviate crowds and long lines. Under this bill, that authority could be curtailed. Under current law, TSA can improve new security requirements such as enhanced passenger screening when intelligence indicates credible threats. Under this bill, how those new security requirements are implemented could be subject of a negotiation with a union. In addition to the impact on security, I'm concerned that this bill would propose to transition screen workforce. It doesn't, I don't think it's fair to dictate which union gets to represent 45,000 screeners, but that's just what this bill does. This bill sets the exclusive bargaining agent for the screeners and requires the TSA to immediately negotiate with them. Under this bill, there's no intervening union election. The screeners never get a chance to exercise their constitutional right is to choose their representation, and I think that's wrong. Beyond the consequences for aviation security and the fundamental questions of fairness, this bill does little to improve the pay and working conditions for screeners. In fact, TSA screeners will lose benefits under this proposal. If this bill becomes law, screeners lose the ability to trade shifts with one another or donate accrued leave to their fellow workers. Certain overtime pay would be prohibited. 5% career milestone bonuses would no longer be offered, and veterans lose out. Currently, veterans have to demonstrate prior service to receive a hiring preference by TSA. Under this bill, veterans would have to meet such much stricter requirements to become eligible. The TSA estimates that by moving the screener workforce under Title V will cost the agency $1.2 billion over the next 5 years. That's a tremendous cost for such a little return. In May 2019, a blue ribbon panel led by Clinton and Obama administration human capital experts strongly argued against moving screeners under Title V because it would do nothing to increase pay for screeners. The panel rightly pointed out that under current law, the TSA can pay screeners more than they would make under Title V. I have long advocated for an increase for screener pay. I think all the points the chairman made in his opening statement about how bad that is are absolutely accurate. But I agree with the blue ribbon panel that TSA should build a pay system prior to that of the GS schedule, superior to that of the GS schedule. Instead of moving this costly bill that would do little to improve the screener morale, we should work together to implement the recommendations of the blue ribbon panel. Finally, I want to thank the men and women of TSA. The debate we've had today does not impact the sincere appreciation that we have for the tremendous job that they do each and every day. While we may disagree on the best way forward, I think that we all share the same goal of improving screener morale. We should understand how important that is to the workforce and to our security. Unfortunately, this bill will do more to undermine that goal, in my opinion, than it would to achieve it. So I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following 3 items. Number 1, a statement of support from Representative Nita Lloyd from New York. Number 2, a statement of support from the American Federation of Government Employees. Number 3, a statement of support from the Transportation Workers Union of America. And number 4, an article dated January 18, 2019, from the Westchester Journal News explaining how TSOs continued to show up for work despite struggling to pay their bills during the shutdown.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you. First, I want to kind of echo your last sentiments. That is that the TSA workers on a daily basis that I've encountered, and through my time as chair of the subcommittee for 4 years that I encountered, have done an amazing job for very little pay. And during the shutdown in Syracuse, my airport, they showed up to work every day like they did across the country. They were without pay, and they struggled without the pay, but they always did their job. And there was a board at the airport, I think it's still there, where people just signed to say thank you for what you did for that. So people recognize it, and we should recognize it justly so. And I absolutely agree with the chairman's comments, and I think throughout his comments, 90 to 95% of them had to do with pay. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think that some of the concerns my ranking member enunciated, I agree with. So I think the bill is a little too broad for me to be able to support, but I do want to make it clear that I think we should work in a bipartisan manner to fix the overwhelmingly glaring issue, and that is their pay disparity. If we fix a pay disparity and make it a more attractive job, especially in this competitive job market, I think it'll be good. But let's not forget, they're doing a great job now under very trying circumstances, and I applaud that. And I don't think we should just talk about pay. I think there's other things within it we need to take a look at and we need to work on together, and I stress the word together. Providing nursing facilities at airports for TSA employees, reinstating full-time benefits for part-time TSA employees. They were eliminated this year, and they should not have been. I think providing longevity pay for workers and finding child care solutions for the workforce. And maybe some of the things you're concerned about with respect to discipline we can talk about as well. But I echo the concerns of the panel about it. going to a Title V, but at the same token, I recognize that the biggest issue is pay, and we should work together to really find a way to pay for it. And you know what? I don't know if you can put a price tag on paying people properly that are waking up every day making sure we're safe on airlines. And I think we should work together on that component of the bill. So unfortunately, I can't support this, but I do support the general tenor of the chairman's comments. I hope we can work together to try and figure that out going forward. And I would yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I go back home to Las Vegas just about every weekend, and I go in and out of McCarran Airport, which is one of the country's busiest, and I see these TSA agents. They work so hard to keep our passengers safe. They inspect cargo, luggage. What they do affects our economy, and it has some impact on national security. So to see them treated differently from most federal employees, to me, just doesn't make any sense. You've heard some arguments that granting them full collective bargaining rights would deny TSA the ability to remove bad actors or interfere with TSA's authority to direct security operations. That just couldn't be further from the truth. Let's look closely at Title V. Under Title V rules, agencies have the ability to waive employee notice requirements and expedite personnel actions against employees accused of criminal activities, point one. Second, agencies also have the flexibility to remove employees from duty if the agency determines an employee may pose a threat to themselves or others that could result in the loss or damage to government property or do anything that jeopardizes legitimate government interests. Since 2011, it's been the TSA's position that its frontline workforce can collectively bargain on a limited basis. Now, once the workforce is transitioned to Title V, the range of issues subject to collective bargaining will expand. However, at the same time, under the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, agencies with workforces that are unionized retain significant authority to carry out the agency's mission, including during emergencies. Furthermore, Title V at Chapter 71 contemplates that if the president comes to believe that national security requirements or considerations necessitate some limitations on bargaining, those can be established through executive order. Let's also remember that other workforces with security missions operate well under Title V, such as Customs and Border Protection officers, Border Patrol agents, and security personnel within the Departments of Defense, State, Commerce, and Justice. You also heard some concerns that the bill might limit the administrator's ability to continue to provide some unique workforce benefits. You heard that they will be worse off under Title V than they are now. Again, that just doesn't make any sense, and you can believe that I talk to these people all the time, and I'm committed to working with the administrator to ensure that on top of baseline Title V benefits, opportunities to trade shifts and other special benefits will continue. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill. I think my constituents and those who work at McCarran Airport are very supportive of it, and I thank the chairman for bringing it.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me commend you for your efforts on this legislation. Reluctantly, I will be voting against it at this stage. I want to identify myself with the remarks of Mr. Katko. I think AFGE does an outstanding job. I've had numerous meetings with them. There's no doubt that I was here along with you, Mr. Chairman. I guess you and I are the only two that were here at the time when TSA was started up, and definitely that was considered to be temporary measures, and it was hoped that as we went forward, corrective action would be taken. Unfortunately, it has not been taken. Certainly on the issue of wages, there's no doubt that TSA employees are being shortchanged. I do think this bill, though, goes too far as issues like flexibility, but I would hope in the end, when this finally does come to a vote, I'll be able to vote for it. I look forward to working with you on it. And again, I've had nothing but very good experiences with TSA, with their representatives, and it's unfortunate this, I think, goes too far, but again, want to commend you. I probably agree with most of what's in here, but Mr. Katko and I are basically on the same page on this. But again, in saying that, I don't, this should not go into a union busting thing. This should be not criticize the employees. They do an outstanding job. They are in a unique position, though, which is why we thought back in 2003, I guess it was 2004, when this was, when TSA was started up, that they are unique and there has to be certain exceptions made. I think, again, mainly on flexibility, but as far as wage scales and others' rights, they should have far more than they have right now. So at this stage, I will vote no. It's a reluctant no, but I hope as we go forward, we can work together. I'm sure Mr. Katko and I and others will work with you if we can find a way to make it more acceptable. So right now, I'm down as a reluctant no, but I want to thank you for your efforts and also thank you for bringing this forward and bringing it up for debate. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you, Chairman Thompson. Proud supporter of this bill, proud co-author. And if I can, just step back for a minute and think about what this is all about. 911. I don't know how many of you remember that dastardly day. I remember watching TV 6 a.m. in California, watching those burning buildings come down. And as I watched people running away for their lives, I saw two sets of individuals running towards those buildings. Public safety officers, firefighters and police officers running into those burning buildings knowing that they were probably going to die. Two things happened in 911. A major breach in our national security. And number two, stepping up of public safety officers to be heroes. Public safety officers that are today represented by strong collective bargaining units at their local level. And I don't think any of us here would argue that that is a detriment to their job. On the contrary, we owe those folks a debt of gratitude. Second of all, TSA officers today have proven that they are also our frontline defenders. All of us understand, all of us that travel every week back and forth home, that those TSA officers are really that thin line, I would call it the thin blue line, that stands between us and another tragic 911 incident. Yet today, TSA officers, more than a third of the agency's employees turn over every 2 years. High turnover, difficult recruiting. When you have shutdowns, they go without pay. We have to remember, ladies and gentlemen, what this bill is about. It's about protecting of passengers in the air. All of us have taken tours of those back rooms at TSA offices. We're investing heavily as a society, as a country, on those very expensive X-ray machines. The next generation, trying to make sure that those machines can distinguish between those things that should not go on the planes and regular stuff that should be okay. Yet, the analysis, the information those X-ray machines present to those workers is as good as the analysis those TSA officers can make on the spot as to whether that is a good judgment or a bad judgment to let those items through. We have to remember that professionalizing the TSA workforce is really about making sure that our airlines, that our public that flies into our airlines are safe. And that's why, Mr. Chairman, I'm a co-author of your bill, because it only takes one incident again to remind us of what being penny foolish is all about. I yield the remainder of my time, and I hope my colleagues can join us in supporting this most important measure to support public safety in the skies. Thank you.
Thank you, gentleman. California yields back. There being no further discussion and no further amendments listed on the roster, the question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute of H.R. 1140. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 1140 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. And the gentleman from Alabama. Recognized.
I asked for a recorded vote.
Okay. Recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Langevin. Aye. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond. Mr. Richmond. Mr. Payne. Aye. Mr. Payne votes aye. Ms. Rice. Ms. Rice votes aye. Mr. Correa. Aye. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes aye. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes aye. Ms. Underwood. Ms. Underwood votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Green of Texas. Mr. Green of Texas votes yea. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman votes yea. Ms. Berrigan. Ms. Berrigan votes yes. Mrs. Demings. Mrs. Demings votes aye. Mr. Rogers.
No.
Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. King. No. Mr. King votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall. Mr. Katko. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko votes no. Mr. Green of Tennessee. Mr. Green of Tennessee votes no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce votes no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw votes no. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Richmond. Aye. Mr. Richmond votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Walker. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Van Drew.
How am I recorded?
The chairman is not recorded.
Chair votes aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 9.
The ayes have it, the motion is agreed to, and the measure as amended is ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 5680. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5680, the Cybersecurity Vulnerability Identification and Notification Act of 2020.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. There are no amendments pre-filed for this bill. Are there any additional amendments to this bill? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 5680 be adopted and ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 1494, H.R. 5273, H.R. 5670, H.R. 5678, H.R. 5679, and I ask unanimous consent that the bills be considered en bloc without objection, so ordered. The clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 1494, H.R. 5273, H.R. 5670, H.R. 5678, H.R. 5679.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bills and amendments filed on the roster were circulated in advance and printed copies are available. Are there any additional amendments to any of these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 1494, H.R. 5273, H.R. 5670, H.R. 5678, H.R. 5679, together with amendments listed on the roster, be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation.
Mr. Chairman,
Jim?
can I speak briefly on 5273?
Yeah,
That's the secure ports.
okay.
I'll be very brief. I just want to commend Ms. Torres Small and Mr. Crenshaw for this bill. Mr. Chairman, as I'm sure you recall, it's about 14 years ago when I was chairman. That was the good old days, and you were the ranking member. We passed the first
Thank
port
goodness for the
security
good
bill.
old days.
And this really shows how far we've come. As I recall that, we had many days and late into the nights because that was really a first impression. That was the first time we dealt with port security. And there were real differences, not necessarily partisan differences. Mainly it was a field we were not that familiar with. And we had testimony after testimony, vote after vote, and we finally came up with the package, which did pass. And the fact that this is going to go today on unanimous consent is a tribute, I think, to the system that is in place, but also I want to commend Ms. Torres Small and Mr. Crenshaw for bringing this up, because as good as the system is, I think it can be improved, and these make significant improvements, so I'm proud to support it, and I thank them for their efforts.
Thank you, gentlemen. And we kind of jumped the gun since you got seniority, but we'll go forward. So hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 1494, H.R. 5273, H.R. 5670, H.R. 5678, H.R. 5679, together with amendments listed on the roster, be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Does any member seek recognition to speak on the adopted bills? Ms. Torres Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Ranking Member, and thank you, Congressman King, for your kind words. It's an honor that the en bloc included a bill I sponsored to improve border security at our land ports of entry. Specifically, the Securing America's Ports of Entry aims to increase the rate of expeditious inspections of vehicles entering the United States with non-intrusive inspection technology systems to 100%. For years, the Customs and Border Protection has used NII systems to see inside vehicles for potential contraband, such as drugs, without physically opening or unloading them. And this is critical since the majority of hard drugs being smuggled into the country are being smuggled through the ports of entry as opposed to between them. However, CBP is currently only scanning about 15% of commercial trucks and 1% of passenger vehicles with NII systems. In 2019, Congress provided CBP $570 million to install additional systems on the southwest border. CBP has indicated that these additional systems will primarily be installed at large ports of entry. Now, this will undoubtedly improve security, but it will also increase the risk that transnational criminal organizations will shift their smuggling efforts to smaller ports of entry, such as those in the district I serve. I, along with my colleague, Congressman Crenshaw, discussed this concern with CBP and port officials during a field hearing we held in my district in Santa Teresa, New Mexico, last month. So it is vital that all ports of entry are appropriately equipped to combat smuggling so we don't see this shifting in targeting. My legislation will require the Secretary of Homeland Security to develop a plan with timeframes and estimated costs for scanning all vehicles with NII systems or other similar technology by port of entry. It will also require DHS to report annually on its progress implementing the plan until all commercial and passenger vehicles are scanned. Mr. Chairman, I am proud of the bipartisan work that went into developing this legislation and that it is co-sponsored by my Republican colleague, Congressman Crenshaw. I also thank my colleagues, Congresswoman Rice, Congressman Correa, and Congresswoman Slotkin for supporting this bill. Lastly, a great debt of gratitude goes to the committee staff for their support and help with this legislation. H.R. 5273, if enacted, will help ensure that our dedicated CBP officers are equipped to secure our ports of entry while facilitating legitimate trade and travel. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two comments on two brief bills. First, H.R. 5679, the CISA Director Reform Act. I want to thank the chairman for the consideration of my legislation. And I want to just make a few comments on it. Defending our federal networks and securing critical infrastructure is a monumental task. I believe it is one of the greatest tasks we have now in this country. Since its establishment, CISA has repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to accomplish its goals. I want to commend the phenomenal job of Director Krebs guiding CISA from its inception and keeping the agency focused on achieving its core mission. As CISA grows, it requires continued steady leadership, from stakeholder engagement in the private sector to its cybersecurity responsibilities on our federal networks. Establishing relationships across agencies and industry is critical for the agency to accomplish its mission. By establishing a politically appointed 5-year term for the position of Director of CISA, will allow CISA to be able to attract the top-level talent required to effectively manage a multitude of responsibilities it directs. Additionally, the establishment of a 5-year term would also guarantee that CISA remains immune from the type of executive-level turnover that could derail it from accomplishing its mission. The importance of the role of director manifests itself across the private and public sector and is growing daily. Maintaining continued leadership with a consistent focus is critical for a young agency to develop its roles in our complex security and intelligence apparatus. And I'll note on top of that we do have to do things to attract the top talent. Right now, there's a labor gap of approximately 300,000 people in the cyber field, and it's expected to grow to over 1 million. The clamor for jobs is going to be even worse as we go forward. So we need to give something to make this position more competitive to the private sector. And I want to thank the Ranking Member Rogers for his support of this legislation, as well as Representatives Langerman and Richmond for their bipartisan support. With respect to 5680, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Langerman again for leading this important piece of legislation. It's a great partnership in the cyber security field between Mr. Langerman, Mr. Richmond, and myself. The CISA plays a vital role in the federal cybersecurity landscape, working with other agencies and critical infrastructure to ensure our security. CISA has the tools to detect vulnerabilities or systems that should not be connected to the internet. CISA tries to identify the entities with vulnerability, but that is not always possible. In some cases, CISA needs the help of internet service providers to make the identification, which is precisely what H.R. 5680 will do. This bill gives CISA the authority to issue an administrative subpoena to an ISP for a limited set of information. However, the administrative subpoena is the last resort for CISA, not the default step when a vulnerability is identified. CISA must make a reasonable effort to identify the entity. CISA's legal authority is limited, and there are clear privacy protections in this bill. I, again, want to thank Mr. Langevin. It's a great bill. It's something CISA needs to help it with its burgeoning capabilities. And for that, I ask that, just for that, to yield back. It's already been passed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank Mr. Katko for his comments, and Mr. Chairman, most especially I want to thank you for including my bill, H.R. 5680, the Cybersecurity Vulnerability Identification Notification Act of 2020, on the list of bills considered today that we voted in favor of. I also especially want to thank Chairman Richmond and Ms. Jackson-Lee for co-sponsoring this important bill, and particularly also thank Ranking Member Katko for working with me to ensure that we continue to show bipartisan support for DHS's newest component, CISA. Mr. Chairman, this bill is predicated on a simple idea that represents really an ethos that we on this committee are very familiar with. If you see something, say something. Our cyber defenders at CISA work tirelessly with security researchers and private sector partners operating our critical infrastructure to keep the country safe in cyberspace. I commend the work of Chris Krebs and his team at CISA. Let me say that at times, their proactive efforts mean that they are aware of vulnerable systems that are accessible over the open internet. These systems can include operational technology or OT devices that control processes that directly affect human health and safety. When CISA discovers these systems or is alerted to their existence by security researchers, it sensibly wants to be able to alert their owners. But oftentimes, the only identifying information CISA has is an IP address. and the internet service providers in control of these IP addresses are expressly prohibited in law from sharing information about their customers with the government absent a warrant or subpoena. So the irony here, Mr. Chairman, is that if there is suspicious activity emanating from a device, that is to say that if it's not just vulnerable, but it's already been exploited by an adversary, the FBI can open an investigation and go and get a warrant. In other words, if we notice that your door is unlocked, we can't tell you about it unless there's a burglar already inside the house. Needless to say, this is not an ideal policy outcome. So we want to proactively address vulnerabilities, not just wait until a cyber incident is actually going on. So my bill closes this loophole, and it does so in a narrowly tailored fashion to ensure that we protect the privacy of companies and their customers. We are clear in the legislation that the information in CISA subpoenas is only to be used for a cybersecurity purpose, not for regulatory or investigative purposes. We also require CISA to develop processes to ensure that the subpoena power is used only as a last resort if CISA cannot identify a system owner through less intrusive means. So this bill reflects the input the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection and Innovation Subcommittee, chaired by Mr. Richmond, received from CISA about real cases where they were unable to take steps to alert vulnerable system owners. And this is a bicameral effort. Senator Johnson and Senator Hassan have also introduced similar legislation in our sister chamber in the Senate. Finally, I just want to also highlight, as a member of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, this is an issue that we've examined closely, and I expect that our report, which will be out soon, to also address the need to close this loophole in the law. As ever, Mr. Chairman, I am grateful to you for your leadership, that of also Chairman Richmond, and especially your excellent staff for working with me on this legislation, particularly Maura Burgeon and Rosalind Cohen. And of course, I want to again thank Mr. Katko for jumping right on this issue from the beginning and working with me very closely on it from the get-go. And I'll also take a moment, just 10 seconds, just to take a moment to acknowledge Mr. Katko's bill that we also reported out, professionalizing CISA's director position. This is also something that the Solarium Commission has looked at, and I strongly support making it clear that, like the FBI, this is a position that needs to be removed from the political push and pull of Washington. The amendment that I offered and that was also adopted simply makes it clear that term limits similar to FBI would apply, namely the CISA director would be able to serve no more than 2 5-year terms. So, Mr. Chairman, these are 2 excellent bills, and I'm glad that we reported them out in a bipartisan basis, and I hope to see them on the House floor very soon. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman from Rhode Island years back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that the en bloc includes H.R. 5670, the Transportation Security Transparency Improvement Act as amended. This is my first bill before the committee, and I believe it is an important step in promoting greater communication with stakeholders that will result in enhanced security across the entire transportation security enterprise. Information sharing between the Transportation Security Administration and transportation stakeholders is critical to the timely and effective mitigation of threats. My bill makes 2 distinct efforts to improve TSA's communication and stakeholder engagement. The first is to improve consistency in TSA's designation and redaction of materials as sensitive security information, or SSI. SSI is defined in federal regulation as information that, if publicly released, would be detrimental to transportation security. While many transportation security stakeholders are authorized to view SSI, inconsistent designation and redaction of information as SSI can unnecessarily hinder the flow of critical information used to secure the nation's transportation networks. To improve consistency, this legislation requires the TSA administrator to ensure clear and consistent SSI designation by regularly reviewing and updating SSI identification guidelines. tracking SSI redaction and designation challenges, and training TSA personnel on these guidelines. The administrator is also required to conduct outreach with air carriers, airport operators, surface transportation operators, and state and local law enforcement to raise awareness of TSA's SSI policies and guidelines to ensure a common understanding and promote greater information sharing. My bill also addresses the security directive and emergency amendment process and their impacts on international aviation security. Air carriers are required to meet TSA security requirements, but TSA may supplement base security requirements through security directives or emergency amendments based on known threats. To improve this process, this bill requires the administrator to develop and implement guidelines that ensure appropriate inclusion of air carriers or other relevant stakeholders from development to implementation. These guidelines must also ensure that new security directives or emergency amendments have defined security outcomes in mind and encourage the consultation of foreign partners. Finally, stakeholder input must be documented, and the process for canceling or incorporating security directives or emergency amendments into TSA security requirements must be defined. I would like to thank Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Rogers for working to get this bill included in the markup today. This legislation will undoubtedly improve aviation security by ensuring TSA clearly communicates critical security information to transportation security stakeholders. I thank my colleagues for their support for the Transportation Security Transportation Improvement Act, and I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Torres Small and Representative Crenshaw, for introducing the bipartisan Securing America's Ports Act. I'm from Michigan. We are a big state with big borders, important borders that have some of the most high volume of traffic of any borders in the country. I spent some time with our CBP folks this past summer, and I was able to speak firsthand with the agents responsible for doing the screening, and they are doing amazing work without, frankly, the resources that they need. The technology that they have is an important tool. Scanning technology is an important tool that now enables them at land ports to effectively and non-intrusively inspect vehicles for contraband, drugs, guns, and ensuring that this technology is deployed comprehensively is going to improve our border security. I will say, just given the sheer volume that we have in Michigan, and particularly the sheer volume of trucks, large trucks, complicated amount of packages. I went into the border and they showed me a FedEx truck coming across the border. It is incredibly detailed work that they're doing to scan these things. I do think we need to help our CBP friends with increased technology and resources. So I'm going to be introducing a bipartisan Intel at Our Borders Act coming up, and this is to help DHS identify a strategic plan on technology, because we can't ask them to do 100% screening without giving them technology that makes it quick and makes it efficient and doesn't slow down the important amount of commerce that's going on in between Canada and, in particular, Michigan. So I really am thrilled with this bill and thrilled to be a co-sponsor. I also just want to take a second and thank both sides of the aisle for their work on the CISA Director Reform Act and the Cybersecurity Vulnerability Identification and Notification Act. These are both good bipartisan bills, and I think it's great that we have decided that the CISA director should stay for 5 years, shouldn't be vulnerable to the political winds. This is about protecting our national security, our homeland security, so I really laud Representative Katko and others who supported this bill, Representative Langevin. I think Chris Krebs is doing a great job and is setting the example of how a CISA director should carry out their work, and I really want to laud them after the back and forth with Iran for coming and briefing us, bringing everyone in. I took that information at an unclassified level that was provided by the department and held a conference call for a bunch of stakeholders across my district on how to protect ourselves. Not because we had direct Iranian threats, but because it was an opportunity to actually deal with this issue. And it was clear that there are deep concerns about the ability to protect ourselves, since Our businesses, our small communities are on the front lines now when it comes to homeland security. And so I really support this idea that CISA is going to be able, as a sort of last resort, to subpoena organizations that are critical infrastructure providers that have a vulnerability. So I laud the committee. Thank you for all your work, and I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you very much. This concludes the consideration of bill noticed by the committee today. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to commend you on the bipartisan manner in which this committee functions. And, you know, to borrow a term from our colleagues on the other side, being fair and balanced has a lot to say about your leadership, that members on the other side have the opportunity to move their legislation forward says a great deal about your leadership. And it just would behoove the other side to reciprocate that type of support. And with that, I'll yield back.
Chair recognizes gentleman from Louisiana.
I was just going to say happy birthday.
Chair recognizes gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1 of the Rules of the House, I move that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the bills ordered reported by this committee today or on similar Senate bills.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
Chair recognizes gentlelady from Texas.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to put into the record that if I had been present, I would have voted aye on the Thompson bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute H.R. 1140, rights for transportation security officers. And I am rising as well to support the 2 amendments accepted, the Jackson Lee amendments to the Transportation Security Transparency Improvement Act, adding an additional law enforcement agency. I ask unanimous consent to place this full statement into the record. And as well, I rise to support my amendment for H.R. 5678, the Privacy Officer Enhancement Act, which adds language dealing with a report on whether the Chief Privacy Officer of the Department of Homeland Security has authorities necessary to ensure that privacy considerations are addressed in planning or updating any program, system, or initiative of the department, including its components. So I ask unanimous consent that that statement be placed in record and the statement regarding the Transportation Security Transparency Improvement Act, and that my aye vote be placed accordingly in the record on H.R. 1140.
Without objections, so ordered. There being no further business to transact, the committee stands adjourned.
Be with you, my friend.
Pleasure.